1861, Portugal, 12 boys were chosen to bleed for the saint. The Braga Pilgrimage Files. In the heart of Braga, 1861, a shadow crept over the town. It wasn't from the mountains or the thick mist rolling off the river. It came from the altar of the town's beloved saint, a saint who, for centuries, had been a source of hope, healing, and devotion. But that year, devotion took a dark, unbearable turn. No one could have predicted it. One morning, the priest delivered a message so chilling that the town fell silent for days. The saint demanded a blood offering. Not just any offering, but the blood of 12 boys, chosen from among the town's children. Fear rippled through homes like wildfire. Mothers wept. Fathers clenched fists in rage and helplessness. And the boys, innocent, laughing just days before, felt the icy hand of dread grip their hearts. It began with a letter, carried by a trembling acolyte to the town square. The words were carefully penned in looping script. To honor the saint and secure Braga's protection, 12 shall bleed in his name. The townspeople whispered to one another in hushed tones, unsure if it was divine instruction or a cruel trick. But when the priest, cloaked in midnight black, confirmed it during Sunday Mass, all doubt vanished. The saint's command was final. Families gathered their children close, but the selection was not random. It was precise. 12 boys, aged between 9 and 12, had to be chosen. Some were orphaned, wandering the streets, or living in crowded homes where their parents had already died of disease. Others were from the wealthier families, their lineage tied to the church's donations. No one knew the full reasoning, and none dared question it aloud. As the days dragged on, fear transformed into obsession. Parents watched their children with anxious eyes, counting their breaths and movements as though each one could reveal a clue. At night, candlelight flickered across trembling faces in tiny bedrooms. Mothers whispered prayers into pillows damp with tears. Fathers muttered oaths to protect what was theirs, yet they knew their power was limited against the weight of faith. The townspeople started seeing omens everywhere. A sudden storm would rage, leaving the cobblestones slick and dark. A cow would die mysteriously in a field, or a child would fall ill without reason. Each incident reinforced the saint's demand. Superstition and terror became intertwined, and Braga held its collective breath, waiting for the day of selection. Rumors of resistance began to stir in whispers between neighbors. Some priests argued quietly that the saints could not demand such cruelty. Others insisted that disobedience would bring curses, plagues, or famine upon the town. Fear created a strange obedience, one that silenced conscience and twisted devotion into something unrecognizable. When the day finally approached, the town seemed caught between two worlds, one of light, of holy processions and chants, and one of shadow, of trembling hands and secret tears. Each step toward the chapel felt heavier, each breath harder to draw. And in the hearts of the 12 boys, a terror they could not fully understand had taken root, growing faster than the spring grass in the hills surrounding Braga. The stage was set. A saint's demand had turned the town into a theater of horror, where faith and fear collided. No one in Braga would leave that day unchanged. The silence before the storm was deafening, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if knowing the town's innocence was about to be shattered. The chosen 12 waited, unaware that their lives were about to become part of a story that would haunt Braga for generations. The first step had been taken, and with it, the line between devotion and atrocity blurred forever. The chapel of Braga had always been a place of warmth, its stone walls echoing hymns and prayers, the scent of incense lingering in the cool air. But in 1861, that familiar sanctuary became something else entirely, a place where shadows moved differently and the silence between prayers carried a weight heavier than stone. It started with whispers. At first, they were barely audible, carried on the drafts that slid through the chapel's narrow windows. Mothers attending Mass spoke quietly to one another, voices trembling as they recounted rumors of the saint's demand. Fathers muttered under their breath while lighting candles. Even the acolytes, usually full of youthful energy, moved with cautious steps, eyes darting nervously to every dark corner. The whispers weren't just talk, they were warnings. Some claimed to have seen figures in the graveyard at night, cloaked in black, chanting over open soil. Others swore they had heard children crying in empty rooms, even when the doors were locked and the town slept. Every story carried the same thread. The 12 boys were marked, their fate sealed by forces beyond comprehension. Inside the chapel, tension hung thick. Candles flickered in the windless air, casting elongated shadows that danced across frescoed ceilings. Every glance felt scrutinized, every cough and shuffle amplified. Even the priest, who had announced the saint's decree, seemed different now. His hand shook when holding the chalice. His eyes darted toward the congregation as if expecting unseen eyes to watch him back. The children themselves sensed it. Boys who had once played tag in the sun now hesitated at the chapel's threshold, feeling the cold stones beneath their feet as a warning. They whispered to one another in corners, exchanging fearful glances, trying to make sense of something that adults refused to fully explain. Yet fear was a language they understood perfectly. Rumors became more specific. Some townspeople claimed that the saint had appeared in visions, pointing towards certain boys in the crowd. Others spoke of hidden signs, a sudden shiver down the spine, a candle that refused to stay lit, or the way birds would scatter when a boy passed. Fear was no longer confined to whispers. It had grown into obsession, infecting every thought, every prayer, every heartbeat in Braga. And then there were the letters. Anonymous notes began appearing on doorsteps and windowsills, scribbled in shaky handwriting. The chosen will bleed for the saint. Hide them if you dare, but the eyes are everywhere. The messages sent families into panic. Some locked their doors and windows. Others fled into the hills under the cover of night. But the town was small, and the saint's influence felt inescapable. Even the walls seemed to listen. Parishioners reported hearing the faintest murmurs during services, voices that weren't theirs, yet mimicked their own thoughts. Children spoke of seeing shadows move against the candlelight, long arms reaching for them, vanishing when touched. The chapel had become a labyrinth of fear, where every corridor whispered secrets, every corner held judgment. The townspeople faced a cruel paradox. They could neither ignore the saint nor protect the boys without risking divine wrath. Families prayed desperately, clinging to hope that perhaps the whispers were lies, that perhaps the saint's demand could be avoided. But deep down, they knew better. The fear had seeped into every stone, every pew, every flickering flame. By the eve of selection, the whispers became a chorus. Children trembled behind closed doors. Parents paced endlessly through their homes. Even the priest seemed haunted, caught between duty and conscience. And through it all, the boys remained unaware of how closely eyes watched them, and how soon they would face the terrifying will of town's faith. Braga slept uneasily that night, its dreams haunted by shadows and whispers. The chapel had spoken, and its words would guide the events to come, shaping destinies in ways no one could undo. The morning of the selection arrived with a strange stillness. A thick fog rolled down from the hills, shrouding Braga in a gray silence. Even the birds seemed to hesitate, perching motionless on the chapel's eaves. The town gathered, drawn to the square by equal parts fear, devotion, and curiosity. None spoke above a whisper. No one laughed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The boys were lined up on the cobblestones, 12 in total, each pale-faced and wide-eyed. Some were the children of merchants, others orphans whose parents had long since disappeared into poverty or illness. Their hands trembled at their sides. Some clutched small charms or rosaries, as if the prayers could shield them from what was to come. The priest, clad in black robes trimmed with gold, stood on the raised platform near the chapel doors. His face was stern, but beneath it flickered a shadow of doubt, an emotion that the town was too afraid to acknowledge. A hush fell over the crowd as the selection began. A small silver bowl, polished until it shone like a mirror, was carried forward. The priest spoke of the saint's will, explaining that 12 boys had been chosen by divine sight, their names drawn in secret. But the truth was far more sinister. The priest's hand hovered over a small scroll on which names were written, not chosen at random, but determined by tradition, superstition, and perhaps something darker still. Families clutched each other. Mothers' nails bit into palms. Fathers' fists clenched so tight their knuckles whitened. Whispers of protest rose, only to die in the icy gaze of the priest. Some tried to step forward to shield their sons, but were held back by neighbors who feared punishment from a force invisible yet absolute. Obedience had become a cage. The boys themselves understood little of the ceremony. They exchanged uncertain glances, the fog of fear clouding their young minds. One boy whispered to another, asking why the saint wanted them to bleed, why faith had turned into terror. His companion's response was a silent shake of the head, as if admitting the question itself was dangerous. Every step felt heavier than the last. The air smelled of damp stone and incense, mingling with the copper tang of anxiety. Then came the moment that would be remembered for decades. The priest unrolled the scroll and called out the names. One by one, the boys were stepped forward, their hearts hammering in their chests. Families sobbed silently, faces pressed against the cold walls of the chapel. Some children tried to resist, to turn away, but unseen hands seemed to guide them forward. The town watched in a combination of horror and awe, believing that each child taken by fate was a guarantee of divine protection. As the final boy was called, a strange silence fell over the square. It was not peaceful. It was tense, expectant, as though the entire town waited for the next heartbeat to decide their collective fate. The priest raised the silver bowl, and the crowd leaned closer, straining to see what would happen next. Some prayed aloud, while others clenched their eyes shut, unwilling to witness the sacred and the horrific intertwined. Even in that moment, subtle signs appeared, hinting that something beyond human understanding had begun. A sudden gust of wind snuffed out candles, leaving shadows to dance on the chapel walls. A distant rumble rolled across the hills, not quite thunder, but not silence either. And the 12 boys, pale and shivering, waited for the hand of faith to descend upon them, unaware of how the events of that day would ripple through Braga's history forever. The ceremony ended with the boys standing alone, the town's eyes upon them. Each step of the pilgrimage, each chant, each trembling moment would leave scars, not only on the children, but on the soul of the town itself. The choice had been made. The saint's demand had been answered, and the shadow over Braga grew heavier, settling like a storm cloud over every home, every heart, every prayer. The selection left Braga split in ways that no one could have imagined. On one side were the devout, those who believed without question that the saint's demand must be fulfilled. They clutched rosaries in trembling hands and muttered prayers under their breath, convinced that obedience was the only path to protection. On the other side were the doubters, parents, neighbors, even some priests, who saw the cruelty for what it was and feared the weight of a moral wrong that could never be undone. The division was subtle at first. Averted glances in the market, cold nods in the chapel. Families that had dined together now ate in silence, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Rumors spread like wildfire. "Did you see the tears on their faces?" some whispered. "They're being punished for their sins," others insisted. Every interaction carried tension, every smile suspicious, every handshake heavy with fear. Mothers wept in secret, hiding their sorrow behind tightly drawn curtains. Fathers wandered through the hills, muttering to themselves, questioning whether faith could ever justify this. Even children sensed the tension, whispering to one another in corners, sharing stories that no adult dared voice aloud. In classrooms, play turned somber. Laughter was scarce, replaced by quiet worry and questions with no answers. The town's leaders attempted to maintain order, but the cracks were growing. The mayor spoke of tradition and obedience, urging families to trust in the saint. Priests delivered sermons steeped in fear and salvation, trying to remind the devout that divine will was above human logic. But with every word, the divide deepened. Some townspeople obeyed out of fear, others out of a desperate hope that the saint's favor would spare their own children. Even the natural world seemed to reflect the town's fracture. Storms came suddenly, dark clouds blotting out the sun. Rain fell in torrents, flooding streets and fields. Crops wilted despite care, and livestock grew restless, as if sensing the tension that humans could not reconcile. Every misfortune was seen as a divine reminder. Braga's unity, once steadfast, had been broken by fear and devotion alike. Families began to take sides openly. Friends stopped visiting each other. Neighbors argued over rituals, questioning who had the right to interpret the saint's will. The air in the chapel became tense, the stone walls echoing murmurs of dissent as much as prayers. Children of differing families avoided each other, fearful that association could mark them for divine wrath. Amidst this, the 12 chosen boys felt the full weight of the town's fracture. They could see it in their families' eyes, pride mixed with terror, devotion tangled with despair. The boys could not understand the politics, the whispered threats, or the moral debates raging around them. All they knew was the tightening grip of fear, the cold shadow of inevitability that stretched over their small lives. The town was a powder keg of belief and rebellion, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. Each conversation, each glance, each hesitant step in the chapel or square carried the tension of a city teetering on the edge of chaos. Braga had always prided itself on faith and community, but now those very pillars seemed to crumble under the weight of fear and moral uncertainty. As night fell, families locked their doors, and the town slept uneasily. Even in their dreams, the shadow of the saint's demand lingered, manifesting in trembling hands, whispered prayers, and footsteps echoing in the empty streets. Braga was no longer a single community. It was a town divided, its soul stretched thin between fear and devotion, between obedience and conscience. And the events of the coming days would push it further, testing the limits of faith, morality, and the bonds that once held it together. The night before the pilgrimage was unlike any Braga had seen. Darkness fell early, thick and suffocating, swallowing the town in shadows. A heavy mist crept through the streets, curling around corners and slipping under doors. Even the stars seemed to hide behind the clouds, leaving only the pale glow of lanterns to fight back the oppressive black. In homes across the town, families huddled together, whispering prayers and clutching one another. Mothers rocked their children silently, tears soaking into the hems of skirts. Fathers paced restlessly, muttering vows of protection they knew they could not fulfill. The 12 chosen boys lay awake in their beds, wide-eyed, listening to the creaks and groans of their homes, as if the walls themselves were alive with anticipation and fear. The air was thick with foreboding. Outside, the river sloshed against its banks, swollen from days of rain. Winds rattled shutters, carrying faint, haunting sounds that no one could identify. Somewhere, an owl hooted, a solitary, sorrowful cry that seemed to echo the town's collective dread. Even animals seemed uneasy. Dogs whimpered in corners, cats prowled the streets with fur on end, and horses refused to settle in their stables. In the chapel, the priest prepared quietly, moving among the flickering candlelight with solemn care. He arranged the silver bowl, polished to a mirrored sheen, and whispered prayers he had long memorized. Yet behind his steady motions, fear trembled in his hands. He had seen the hesitation in his congregation, heard the whispers of rebellion, and understood the gravity of the task before him. And still, He could not stop what had been set in motion. Neighbors moved silently along the cobblestones, some lighting candles at the shrine, others kneeling in quiet corners. Each flame flickered against the fog, casting grotesque shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls. Whispers of doubt mingled with prayers, carrying fears that had no words. The town seemed to hold its breath, caught between devotion and terror, as though the very night itself were watching. The 12 boys felt the weight of all eyes, though none could see them in the dark. Dreams came in fragments, visions of strange figures, shadows reaching for them, whispers calling their names. Each dream ended with the same sensation, a cold hand pressing against their chests, a suffocating reminder that the next day would change everything. Some families tried to protect their children with charms and prayers, placing them under pillows, in shoes, or hanging talismans around their necks. Others sat in silence, staring into the flickering firelight, unable to speak, unable to pray, frozen in a mix of hope and despair. The fear was contagious, seeping into every corner, into every heartbeat. By midnight, the town was eerily silent. Only the river and the wind dared to move. The chapel loomed in the mist, a dark silhouette against the foggy night, holding its secrets and shadows. In every home, families waited, wondering if they could endure the morning. And in the hearts of the 12 chosen boys, fear had taken root so deeply it could not be shaken, not by prayer, nor by charm, nor by the faintest hope of mercy. Braga had never known such a night. Every sound, every shadow, every whisper carried the promise of what was to come. The night before the pilgrimage was a crucible, forging fear and faith into a single, unbreakable tension. When dawn finally arrived, no one in Braga would be the same. The town had passed through a darkness deeper than night, a darkness that had already claimed pieces of every heart within it. Dawn broke over Braga like a reluctant witness, pale light cutting through the lingering mist. The town square, usually bustling with merchants and laughter, was silent, save for the soft patter of anxious footsteps and the distant toll of the chapel bell. The 12 boys stood in a line, their small bodies trembling, eyes wide with fear. The cobblestones beneath them, slick from the previous night's rain, glistened like wet glass, reflecting the dread in their faces. The priest stepped forward, silver bowl in hand, its surface catching the first shards of sunlight. He spoke of faith, of divine favor, of protection for the town, but his words fell hollow. The people listened, mouths tight, hearts heavy. No one could speak the doubts aloud, yet they burned in every mind. Devotion had become a cage, and fear was the lock. The ceremony began with a ritual that seemed to stretch time itself. Each boy was approached, examined as if by invisible eyes, and prepared for the offering. Families strained against the inevitable, pressing hands to lips, holding prayers like shields. Some mothers could not bear to watch and turned their faces to the walls of the chapel. Fathers gritted teeth, whispering promises they could not keep. When the first cut was made, the town fell silent. The sharp, metallic scent of blood rose into the damp morning air, mingling with incense and fog. The boys' small gasp echoed, a sound that would haunt every witness for the rest of their lives. Children, too young to understand the full meaning, shrank against their parents, sensing that something sacred had been violated. The next moments unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. One by one, the boys were brought forward, the silver bowl catching the crimson drops that fell upon the cobblestones. Their cries mingled with the whispered prayers of the crowd, creating a sound that was both desperate and surreal. The fog swirled around the square, hiding some details, yet exposing others with cruel clarity. Shadows danced across faces, flickering in the pale light, as if mocking the town's devotion. Some townspeople fainted. Others held their ground, rigid with terror and faith intertwined. The air felt charged, almost alive, humming with energy that was part fear, part reverence. Children who were not chosen clutched each other, watching silently, absorbing the lesson that obedience demanded a terrible price. By mid-morning, the square was slick with more than just rain. The scent of iron lingered, clinging to the stone and to the memories of those who witnessed it. Parents whispered curses at the sky, murmuring apologies and pleas, while priests murmured blessings over trembling hands. The line between sacrifice and atrocity blurred, leaving only the echo of a saint's command and the unbearable human cost. The boys, exhausted and pale, were led from the square. Their eyes, wide with disbelief and terror, reflected a future that would never be the same. The town itself seemed altered, haunted by the ritual it had sanctioned, its streets soaked with both devotion and guilt. Every footstep carried the weight of sorrow, every glance a reminder of innocence lost. By evening, Braga had returned to a fragile quiet, but the shadows lingered, and the town's collective soul bore the scars of a day that faith demanded, but humanity questioned. No one spoke openly, yet every mind wrestled with the same question. Had they honored their saint or condemned their children? The memory of that morning, of the blood on the cobblestones, would haunt Braga for generations, whispering a story of fear, faith, and the unbearable cost of obedience. Not everyone in Braga could bear to look. Some hid behind doors, pressed their faces against windows, or slipped into alleyways where shadows offered partial concealment. They were the silent witnesses, eyes wide with terror, hearts pounding in unison with the frightened boys in the square. Their silence was not acceptance, it was survival. Children, too young to understand fully, watched from hidden corners. They saw faces twisted in fear and awe, hands clenched in desperate prayer, and a priest whose authority trembled with the enormity of what he had sanctioned. They carried the memory of screams, the metallic scent of blood, and the eerie quiet that followed each small cry. Even without words, the lessons of that day were etched into their souls. Fear could command obedience, and devotion could demand horror. Among the silent witnesses were the elderly, who had lived through plagues, wars, and floods. They understood that fear could shape behavior, but nothing had prepared them for this. Some prayed silently. Others muttered curses under trembling breaths, questioning whether the saint they had revered for decades could truly demand such cruelty. Their eyes followed every movement, noting small details, the tremor of a boy's hand, the glint of sunlight on the silver bowl, the way the crowd avoided one another's gaze. Every detail would be remembered. Even animals seemed to bear witness. Horses shied in their stalls, dogs whimpered in corners, and cats slinked silently along walls, all sensing the tension that human eyes could barely comprehend. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, streets and buildings steeped in the echo of terror and devotion intertwined. The priests who remained in the chapel were witnesses as well, but in a different way. They had sanctioned the ritual, yet many felt the weight of conscience pressing against their robes. Some wrote notes in secret, hoping to record the events without judgment, while others simply observed, eyes downcast, caught between duty and horror. The silver bowl, polished and cruelly reflective, became a symbol of everything they could not say. In private homes, parents clutched each other, trembling and silent. The chosen boys' siblings stared out windows long after the procession ended, tracing the path where their brothers had walked. They did not speak of what they saw, but every gesture, every movement, was stored in memory, ready to replay in dreams for years to come. The town's silence was heavy, but it spoke volumes. Fear had transformed into obedience, sorrow into ritual, and horror into history. Even those who did not witness the blood directly felt its presence in the air, thick and suffocating, a reminder that what had occurred was beyond ordinary comprehension. By nightfall, the silent witnesses carried a shared understanding. Braga had crossed a threshold. Innocence had been violated. Faith had demanded a price that no child, parent, or town elder could forget. And though they did not speak, they knew that their memories, their silent observation, would be the threads connecting past to future, a hidden record of terror, obedience, and the fragility of human morality. The echoes of that day lingered like a shadow over every home and street, shaping the town in ways words could never fully capture. And for the 12 boys, the silent witnesses' eyes, watching, remembering, became yet another weight to bear, another reminder that nothing in Braga would ever be the same. When the ritual ended and the silver bowl was set aside, Braga exhaled a heavy, trembling breath. But relief did not come. The town felt hollow, as though a piece of its soul had been carved out and left exposed. Streets were quieter, homes dimmer, and even the chapel seemed smaller, its walls heavier with the weight of what had transpired. Families mourned privately, for fear that public grief would invite judgment. Mothers wept into pillows, their sobs muffled yet relentless. Fathers walked the cobblestones late into the night, haunted by the cries of the boys they could not protect. Even children who had not been chosen felt the weight of loss, an invisible shadow pressing against their hearts, whispering that innocence could vanish in a single morning. The town tried to return to normal. Markets reopened, churches held mass, and neighbors exchanged greetings. But everything was touched by the memory of that day. Conversations faltered, laughter became cautious, and smiles felt brittle. The shadow of the pilgrimage lingered, stretching over each family, each street, each stone of square. Some tried to rationalize the events. Priests insisted that divine will was inscrutable, that the saint's favor had been secured, that the offering was necessary to protect Braga from unseen calamities. Others argued quietly that humanity had overstepped, that no saint could demand such cruelty, and that guilt would linger longer than blessing. These arguments rarely reached the public square. They remained whispered confessions between family members, like sparks hidden in the dark. The chosen boys bore the deepest scars. Though unharmed in body, the memory of fear and anticipation lingered. Some refused to speak, eyes distant and haunted. Others trembled at the sound of footsteps or the faintest echo of chanting. Their lives, once ordinary and playful, were now irrevocably marked. School, play, even meals became exercises in endurance. The innocence stolen that day could never be reclaimed. Stranger still were the unexplained occurrences that followed. Crops failed without reason. A sudden illness swept through livestock. Families reported strange sounds at night, doors opening and closing on their own, shadows flitting just beyond the reach of candlelight. Superstition took hold once more, mingling with grief, and the townspeople began to wonder if the saint's favor came at a cost they had yet to fully understand. Even decades later, Braga remembered. Stories of the 12 boys were whispered quietly, often with shame or fear. Some families swore to never speak of it again. Others quietly honored the children in secret rituals, lighting candles in dark corners or leaving offerings at the chapel. The memory persisted, a cautionary tale about devotion, fear, and the fine line between faith and cruelty. The town itself seemed changed. Where laughter had once filled the streets, silence lingered longer than comfort. Where neighbors had once been close, distance grew, measured in avoidance and unspoken guilt. And within the hearts of every witness, a simple truth remained. Braga had survived, but had paid a price no coin or prayer could ever redeem. The aftermath was not just sorrow, it was transformation. Fear, faith, guilt, and grief intertwined to create a town forever altered, a community that carried both memory and warning in every quiet corner. And for the 12 boys, the echoes of that morning would never fade, marking not only their childhood, but the history of Braga itself. Long after the events, the town's archives told a different story. Official records were scarce, written in careful, sanitized language that hid fear beneath formality. The silver bowl, the trembling boys, the blood on the cobblestones, they were mentioned only as ritual offerings or pilgrimage observances. Details that could expose guilt or terror were omitted, as though paper could erase memory itself. Some records were deliberately vague. Names were changed, dates shifted, events described in euphemism. A priest's diary noted only that 12 children were presented for blessing, leaving out the fear and anticipation that had gripped every soul. Letters between church officials spoke in cryptic tones, hinting at divine approval while never revealing the human cost. Even those who wrote them seemed aware that the truth was dangerous, capable of awakening ghosts that were better left sleeping. Hidden among the pages, however, were subtle clues. Marginal notes, smudged by time and trembling hands, hinted at sorrow and protest. A fleeting mention of a mother's tears, a boy's whispered prayer, or the town's quiet dissent appeared sporadically, almost as if the authors themselves could not fully admit what had occurred. Those who discovered these hints later described a sense of unease, as if the shadows of the past had seeped into the ink itself. Local historians would later struggle to reconstruct the events accurately. Conflicting accounts, oral traditions, and a deliberate obfuscation in records created a web of uncertainty. Some accounts spoke of miraculous protection following the ritual. Others told of illness, misfortune, and a town haunted by what had been done. The truth lay somewhere in the middle, obscured by faith, fear, and human attempts to control memory. Even within the church, secrecy prevailed. Priests who had witnessed the events quietly swore each other to silence. Some feared divine retribution. Others feared human judgment. Every conversation was weighed, every word considered for its potential to unravel the fragile veil of obedience and faith. Letters that described horror in detail were hidden in attics, buried beneath floorboards, or destroyed entirely. Only fragments survived, like scattered echoes of a memory too terrible to face directly. The town's ordinary citizens also played a role in preserving secrecy. Families whispered warnings to their children. Speak nothing of that day, or misfortune will follow. Legends grew around the event, cloaked in symbolism and moral lesson, slowly distancing the memory from reality. Over time, the true horror of the pilgrimage became myth, a story half told, filtered through fear and reverence. Yet Braga could not entirely forget. Every so often, a historian or priest would stumble upon a smudged note or a hidden ledger, feeling a chill at the faint traces of truth. Even decades later, the town's collective memory lingered in hushed conversations, in lingering gazes toward the chapel, in the quiet dread that sometimes settled over the square. The hidden records were a testament not only to what had been done, but to the lengths humanity would go to hide the darkness it cannot face. Through secrecy, omission, and careful rewriting, Braga attempted to preserve its reputation. But memory, especially one steeped in fear and blood, cannot be fully erased. The records may have hidden the details, but they could not hide the echoes, the ghosts of 12 boys who had been chosen, and a town forever haunted by their story. Time moved forward, as it always does, but Braga could never fully escape that fateful year. The 12 boys, once trembling and terrified, grew into adults marked by memory and shadow. Some spoke little, carrying the events silently within their hearts. Others left the town altogether, unable to endure the constant reminders in the streets, the chapel, and the whispers that never truly faded. Families changed as well. Some could never recover from the fear and loss, their grief twisting into quiet bitterness. Others clung even more tightly to faith, as if doubling devotion could erase guilt or restore innocence. The town itself became a patchwork of memory and silence, devotion and fear, each corner steeped in the echoes of that morning on the cobblestones. The story of the 12 boys became legend, half forgotten and half remembered. Children were told tales of obedience and divine favor, while the true horror was whispered only in corners, where adults could speak without risking judgment. Some families kept secret shrines, lighting candles in memory of the boys, their small acts of remembrance hidden from the world. Others erased all traces, unwilling to confront what faith had demanded. Yet the boys' legacy persisted in other ways. The town itself bore scars in its streets and rituals. Pilgrimages continued, but they were tempered with fear and careful restraint. Every step, every chant, carried an unspoken acknowledgement of the cost of obedience. Even those who did not understand the full story felt its weight, an invisible hand guiding reverence with shadows of past terror. Over the years, historians and travelers would record Braga's story, piecing together fragments from oral tradition, church records, and hidden diaries. Each account painted a slightly different picture, but the core remained the same. 12 boys had been chosen, faith had demanded a terrible price, and the town had survived, though forever altered. The legacy extended beyond memory. In the quiet of the chapel at night, some claimed to feel the presence of the boys, watching silently, reminding the town of what had been lost. Parents told their children to be careful, to respect tradition, but also to question cruelty. The story became both a warning and a remembrance, a tale of devotion turned dark, and innocence sacrificed at the altar of fear. Generations later, Braga still whispered the names of the 12 boys, though few knew them all. The town had learned to live with the past, but never to forget it. Every stone of the square, every flicker of candlelight, every shadow in the chapel carried a memory of that day. The boys' story had become part of the town's soul, silent, haunting, and enduring. Braga had survived the saints' demand, but at a cost that could never be measured. The legacy of the forgotten boys was not only in the lives they lived afterward, but in the lessons their suffering etched into the heart of a town. That faith can inspire devotion, but also horror. That obedience can demand sacrifice, but leave lasting scars. And that even in silence, memory carries the weight of truth. The town learned, slowly and painfully, that some shadows never fade. And in Braga, the echo of 12 boys chosen to bleed for the saint remained, a haunting reminder that history is written not only in triumph, but also in fear, blood, and the courage to remember.